Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
You ever wake up from a dream where you're, say, taking a high-stakes math test inside a submarine, but for some reason the submarine is actually your childhood kitchen?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Right, and the teacher handing out the exam is somehow both your current boss and your dog.
And it makes perfect sense in the moment.
Exactly. It makes total sense until you wake up and you just sit up in bed blinking in the dark, wondering what on earth your brain was doing for the last 8 hours.
It really is the universal morning after confusion. We open our eyes, and the very first thing we do is try to apply waking logic to a nocturnal theater production that completely ignores every fundamental rule of reality.
It totally feels like a glitch or, a misfiring hard drive.
Right, a glitch or just random meaningless static.
But that's exactly what we're looking at today, because Professor R.J. Starr recently published this fascinating monograph called The Architecture of Dreaming. And he argues that this glitch, that bizarre submarine math test, is actually a non-negotiable maintenance phase keeping you sane.
Keeping you fundamentally functional, yeah.
So today, for this deep dive, we are looking closely at his research to understand why our dreams are so incredibly weird, yet feel so undeniably real.
And Starr grounds his whole theory in a very specific and, I think, brilliant foundational metaphor.
An architecture part.
Exactly. He suggests we think of our waking psychological life as a tightly organized, heavily managed building. So during the day, your waking mind constructs this massive scaffolding of what he calls coherence.
Coherence. Okay, so like making sense of things.
Right. The scaffolding is what keeps everything functioning in your day-to-day life. It keeps your timeline straight, it keeps your identity stable, and it ensures your reactions are socially appropriate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if waking life is the scaffolding going up, dreams are what happens when the scaffolding comes down for essential overnight repairs.
That's the idea.
But wait, if this scaffolding is so vital to keeping us from, falling apart in public, what makes these overnight repairs so essential? I mean, why can't the scaffolding just stay up forever?
Yeah. Because maintaining that scaffolding is a massive neurological effort.
It's exhausting.
It is incredibly exhausting. Simply being a logical, continuous person takes an incredible amount of metabolic work. Starr calls this enforcing surface coherence.
Surface coherence, so just keeping the mask on.
Exactly. Your brain, specifically your prefrontal cortex, is essentially working overtime every single waking second. It is constantly filtering your thoughts, maintaining your continuous sense of self, checking your environment for social cues.
Making sure you don't say the wrong thing.
Right, and making sure you don't react to every single emotional impulse that bubbles up during the day.
Which, is completely necessary for society to function. Because if someone cuts you off in traffic on your way to work, or say your boss sends you a deeply passive-aggressive email at 2 in the afternoon.
You can't just lose it.
You can't. You can't just break down weeping or start throwing office supplies across the room. You have to keep it together.
You do. You have to. And because you are so busy maintaining this surface coherence, you simply don't have the time or the neurological capacity to fully process complex or inconvenient emotions in the moment.
So they just get pushed aside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you feel a sudden pang of grief during your morning commute or intense anger in a meeting, your prefrontal cortex essentially suppresses it. It defers the processing.
Wow.
But that emotion doesn't just vanish into thin air. It creates what Starr terms an emotional backlog, or he sometimes calls it unresolved emotional salience.
It just builds up.
It's an invisible pressure that builds up in your psychological system throughout the entire day.
Thinking about it that way makes waking consciousness feel like a really high-strung PR manager.
Oh, I like that.
Like your daily life is a continuous press conference, and this PR manager is constantly sweeping inconvenient emotional messes under the rug just to keep the event moving forward. No time for that lingering sadness right now. Smile for the cameras. We'll deal with the existential dread later.
Yes. The PR manager is fiercely enforcing the narrative of you as a functional adult.
So for you listening right now, think about that subtle slight from a coworker yesterday that you had to brush off, or that moment of anxiety you felt reading the news that you just pushed down to finish a spreadsheet. Your brain didn't delete those feelings. It just shelved them.
It put them in the backlog.
Right. But if this PR manager is doing such a stellar job keeping us functional and employed during the day, why not just unplug the system at night, like a laptop? You close the lid, power down, clear the RAM, and start fresh in the morning. Why do we even need to dream?
Well, the human brain cannot simply power down because that emotional pressure, all those messes swept under the rug by the PR manager, it has a physical, neurochemical reality.
No, it's physical.
It has to go somewhere. If you just powered off like a laptop, that backlog would still be sitting there the next morning. Eventually, the structural integrity of your psychological building would fail.
The building collapses.
The PR manager would be totally overwhelmed, and you'd have a breakdown. So the brain is forced to process this backlog, but it fundamentally cannot do it while the PR manager is awake and enforcing the rules of reality.
So is it just pure exhaustion that finally forces the PR manager to clock out? Or is there like a physical switch that gets flipped when we close our eyes?
It's actually a very literal, measurable physical shift. When you fall asleep and eventually enter REM sleep, which is the phase where most vivid dreaming occurs, the brain undergoes a profound neurochemical switch. The aminergic system shuts down and the cholinergic system takes over.
Okay, hold on. Aminergic and cholinergic, you're losing me a bit with the chemical names here.
Sorry.
What exactly are these systems doing physically in the brain?
Fair enough. Think of the aminergic system as the structural beams holding up your waking logic. It relies on neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine.
Okay, I know those.
Right. These are the chemicals that support executive function, reality testing, and linear time. When you enter REM sleep, the supply of these specific chemicals drops to almost zero.
So the office lights are turned off.
Exactly. Then the cholinergic system takes over, flooding the brain with acetylcholine. This is a chemical associated with extreme neurological plasticity, intense visual imagery, and really high emotional arousal. The night crew has arrived.
So the PR manager is completely locked out of the building. And I'd assume without serotonin and norepinephrine enforcing the rules, the brain just turns into a total free-for-all, like a random noise generator of pure static and chaos.
See, that is exactly what older neurological theories used to claim, but Starr argues strongly against that. He introduces a concept he calls the asymmetry principle.
The asymmetry principle?
Yes. When the PR manager leaves, the brain doesn't just globally degrade into chaos. Instead, it selectively and asymmetrically relaxes very specific rules of reality, while keeping other systems fiercely active and online.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. So the brain is playing favorites with reality. What rules get dropped and what stays active?
Well, the mind drops the expensive surface rules, the things that take a massive amount of metabolic energy to maintain. Spatial geometry is one of the first to go.
So that's why you can walk through a door in your apartment and seamlessly step into a dense pine forest.
Exactly. Timeline logic is also abandoned. You can be your current adult self, but also be desperately cramming for a middle school history test. Identity boundaries become incredibly porous, too. You might be observing yourself from a third-person perspective or acting in ways totally contrary to your waking moral code.
The scaffolding comes down, taking time and space with it.
But the asymmetry lies in what is preserved. Because what absolutely stays online and even gets heightened are the deep evolutionary survival systems.
Like what?
Emotional salience, threat detection, and attachment significance. Even if you are standing in a forest that used to be your kitchen, you still feel genuine physiological fear if something is chasing you.
Right.
You still care deeply about the people who appear in the dream, and you still instantly recognize what is emotionally important.
Oh, wow. Thinking about it that way completely flips the script. The dream isn't confused at all. It's prioritizing. It's evolutionary brilliance.
It really is.
So my dream self totally forgets that I don't live in my childhood home anymore, because enforcing a strict chronological timeline is too metabolically expensive for the brain to bother with at night.
Right, it's just not worth the energy.
But my dream self is still absolutely terrified of the monster hiding in the closet, because human survival depends on constantly practicing threat detection.
And that evolutionary brilliance is what elevates dreaming from mere biological static to a highly evolved survival mechanism. The brain drops the supernatural rules of reality so it can do deep, unconstrained emotional work while we rest. It preserves what matters most to our survival, which is emotion and threat assessment, and just ditches the rigid facts.
But wait, if timeline logic and spatial reality are entirely thrown out the window, how is a dream organized? Because even the weirdest dreams aren't totally random. They have a flow, you know? You have an environment. If waking logic is gone, what is the new rule book?
Starr calls this new rule book affective logic.
Affective logic.
Okay. In waking life, your reality is organized by a narrative timeline. It relies on cause and effect, moving strictly from the past to the present. Dreams, however, are organized entirely by emotional resonance, or what Starr terms affective equivalence.
Meaning things are grouped together purely because they feel the same.
Exactly. Let's look at that childhood home example from Starr's work, since you brought it up. Say you have a dream where you are wandering around the house you grew up in.
Very common dream.
Right. According to affective logic, your brain isn't just randomly playing a tape of your old bedroom. The dream places you in that specific environment because that home holds your foundational emotional template for feelings of safety or perhaps authority or anxiety.
Okay, so if I'm incredibly stressed at work today because my boss is heavily micromanaging and judging me, my dream might drop me back into my childhood kitchen tonight. Not because my boss has anything to do with my childhood, but because the raw feeling of being judged by a looming authority figure perfectly matches the feeling I had as a 7-year-old when I was in trouble with my parents.
You've got it. In affective logic, distance isn't measured in miles or in years. It is measured in emotion. Two things that share the exact same emotional weight are placed right next to each other in the architecture of the dream.
It's like reorganizing a massive, chaotic bookshelf.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Like during the day, the PR manager insists all the books are sorted strictly alphabetically by author. That's our timeline logic. It makes sense, it's chronological, it's how waking society functions.
Very ordered.
But at night, the PR manager goes home, the acetylcholine floods in, and the brain reorganizes the entire bookshelf purely by color. That's the emotional feeling. So a bright red book of anxiety from 20 years ago sits directly next to a bright red book of anxiety from yesterday afternoon. Two completely different eras of your life sitting side by side simply because they share the same emotional color.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. And because the brain is organizing by color, by emotion, affective logic allows for a phenomenon that waking logic simply cannot handle.
What's that?
The complete tolerance of contradiction. Starr calls this symbolic compression.
Okay, so this sounds like the mechanism behind the boss who is also your dog. Or I guess more seriously, the boss who is also your parent. How does the brain physically merge those things?
Well, in waking life, the aminergic system keeps the neural networks for boss and mother strictly separated through reality monitoring. A person cannot be two people at once.
Right, that's just a basic fact.
But in REM sleep, because those two networks share the same emotional tag, perhaps the feeling of demanding your attention or a mix of nurturing and judgment, the cholinergic system allows both neural networks to fire simultaneously.
Oh, wow.
The dream simply visualizes both at once. A figure who is simultaneously your strict, demanding boss and your loving, protective mother is an emotionally precise representation. The dream is compressing them into one symbol because your relationship with both of them carries the same complex, contradictory emotional weight.
So it isn't a mistake or a visual glitch. It is actually a much more accurate representation of how complicated the feeling is without the constraints of waking facts getting in the way.
Exactly. The dream is aiming for affective accuracy, not factual accuracy. It doesn't care about the facts of your waking life. It cares about the deepest truth of your emotional life.
Well, wait, I have to push back on this a little because some dreams, DO, have a narrative. I've definitely had dreams with a very clear plot, a beginning, a middle, and an end, almost like a movie. How does affective logic account for a narrative structure if it's only organizing by emotion?
That's a great point. Often what feels like a clear narrative is actually something your waking brain imposes the moment you open your eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, as the aminergic system reboots, it frantically tries to stitch the fragmented emotional scenes together into a story that makes chronological sense. But even when a dream does seem to have a linear plot while you're in it, it is a narrative driven by emotional momentum, not causal logic.
Give me an example.
Well, you might be running down a hallway, which feels like a narrative, but you are running because the emotion of anxiety is escalating, not because the physical layout of the hallway dictates it.
Ah, I see. The emotion is the engine driving the car, and the scenery just shifts to match the speed.
Precisely.
Now, I want to apply all of this, the scaffolding coming down, affective logic, the emotional backlog, to the most intense, overwhelming emotional experience we face as humans. Grief.
Yes.
How does this bizarre architecture handle the profound loss of a loved one?
It is the ultimate stress test for the human psychological system. To understand grief dreams, we have to look at what Starr calls internal working models. When you love someone deeply, you don't just possess a collection of memories of them. Your brain constructs an internal working model of that person. They become woven into your own identity architecture.
Because the brain is essentially a prediction machine, right?
Yeah.
When you love someone, you are constantly predicting their reactions, the sound of their voice, how they would answer a question.
Yes, and that prediction circuitry is physical. They are literally a load-bearing wall in your psychological building.
Wow.
So the physical person may pass away, but that internal working model, the neurological circuitry of expectation and attachment, it remains fully intact. The work of grief, the exhausting, painful daily reality of it, is the slow, painstaking process of dismantling and updating that internal structure to reflect their permanent physical absence.
And Waking Life, our high-strung PR manager, can only handle a tiny fraction of that demolition work at a time. It's simply too heavy. You'd never be able to function.
Exactly, which is why the dream state takes over the heavy lifting. When someone is grieving, they frequently report incredible, vivid, jarring dreams where the deceased person is just, well, they're just there, alive.
Sitting at the kitchen table.
Yeah.
Talking to them.
Right. And people always say it feels more real than waking life.
Why does it feel so overwhelmingly real? Is the brain just playing a high-definition memory?
It is not a memory playing back. This is where the asymmetry principle and affective logic combine to do their most profound work. Remember, reality monitoring and timeline logic are completely relaxed. The dream environment doesn't know it's a dream, and it doesn't enforce the boundary between the past and the present.
Because that timeline logic is offline.
Exactly. But the emotional reality, that physical internal working model of the person, is incredibly strong. So relying on affective logic, the dream experiences them not as a distant memory, but as a fully present reality right now.
They are entirely brought into the present tense.
The affective geometry of the dream places the immense feeling of their presence right next to you. And this creates what is perhaps the most profound tolerance of contradiction in human psychology.
It's deeply beautiful, but it's also heart-wrenching. Because the dream is holding an impossible contradiction. You're experiencing the intense, genuine joy of their presence, and at the exact same time, you're feeling the profound, crushing sorrow of their loss. Both exist fully at the exact same moment.
Which forces us to ask, why does the brain put us through that? Why force us to experience the presence and the total loss simultaneously?
Yeah, why? It seems so cruel.
Because that is the ultimate necessary work of the dream state. Narrative logic, our waking logic, demands an either-or scenario. A person is either alive or dead. But emotional logic has the capacity to hold both the deep love and the permanent absence at once. By forcing you to experience this impossible contradiction in the safe, unconstrained space of the dream, the brain is gradually updating that internal working model.
It's doing the structural maintenance work on that load-bearing wall, carefully retrofitting it so the building doesn't collapse.
Yes. It is allowing the waking mind to eventually survive the grief. By processing that raw, massive emotional backlog at night, the dream prevents the waking system from failing under the weight of it all. It is structural reorganization at its deepest, most fundamental level.
This is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered the scaffolding coming down, PR managers sweeping messes under rugs, neurochemical switches turning off reality, and the profound way our minds process the weight of grief. If we boil all of this down, so what does this all mean for you, the listener? What is the absolute core takeaway from Professor Starr's architecture of dreaming?
If we synthesize all these mechanisms, the core message is a massive reframe of how we view our own minds. Dreaming is not a glitch. It is not a random hallucination caused by a misfiring brainstem, and it isn't some mystical secret code you need a dictionary to decipher. It is a vital, necessary structural maintenance phase. By actively dropping our logical scaffolding at night, by firing the PR manager, shutting off the aminergic timeline, and leaning into affective logic, our minds are able to clear out the emotional pressure cooker of the day. It is this nightly dive into the bizarre that actually allows us to wake up the next morning and be a coherent, functioning, logical person again.
The weirdness is the feature, not the bug.
Absolutely.
Waking life takes an incredible amount of effort. Just appearing normal at the grocery store or in a Zoom meeting hides so much invisible labor that your mind is constantly doing. And that brings us right back to where we started today. That bizarre dream with the submarine, the math test, and the dog. It is not random nonsense. It is your brain doing the heavy emotional lifting so you don't have to carry it around all day.
It is the architecture of your mind, revealing its true shape only when the lights go out.
I love that. So I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder tonight. As you lay your head on the pillow, close your eyes, and prepare to drift off, ask yourself, what emotional messes did your waking mind politely sweep under the rug today? What subtle frustrations, hidden anxieties, or fleeting joys did your inner PR manager say, we simply don't have time for this right now, too? And more importantly, what kind of bizarre, beautiful, emotionally vivid architecture is your sleeping mind going to build tonight to clean it all up?
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.